Hi everyone! Yes, today we are going to cover another longer and tougher chapter on the respiratory system. And hence it is the reason why I have scheduled 2 lecture days for this chapter. There will be a few laws that you have to know that has to do with pressures. And just like capillary exchange chapter, there will be some numbers you have to know that has to do with how much oxygen and carbon dioxide are there at different points of circulation. So that's why how I talked about the cardiovascular system is very highly related to respiratory system. It really connects the whole story together in terms of how blood and air work together to deliver oxygen and carbon dioxide around the body. So be sure to get ready to take notes, draw diagrams, and follow along, okay? All right, let's get started. As usual, we will start off the chapter with a quick overview of the system. Then we will discuss the different anatomical aspects of the components of the system. And we'll leave the physiology part of the inhalation and exhalation last. And as we know it, our respiratory system, of course, is composed of anatomical structures that has to do with ventilation. Ventilation is defined as being able to provide air through our lungs. Okay, so ventilation is not talking about gas exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, is how we are able to breathe in air and how we are able to breathe out air. Okay, we'll talk about how pulmonary ventilation work in terms of the pressure and the volume within our lungs. And the other important part of respiratory system then is conducting gas exchange, which is the critical part or whole main goal of the respiratory system needs to do is we have to take in oxygen and release carbon dioxide via just diffusion across our alveoli and our blood within the capillaries, within the lung capillaries we mentioned before. Okay, all right. So diffusion of these two gases. Okay. Now these are the basic functions of the respiratory system. And we'll talk about the details of each of these as we move along within the chapter. But let me go over these as an overview of what we're going to talk about. Okay, so first, our lungs provide an extensive surface area for gas exchange between the air and the blood. So we're going to talk about that blood-air barrier between alveoli and the capillaries. Second thing is that we will be moving how air is moved to and fro, exchange surfaces of the lungs along the whole respiratory passageway. Thirdly, we'll talk about how respiratory surfaces also protect our, respiratory airways from dehydration, temperature changes, and pathogens, which is bulkily what we'll talk about in the first part of the lecture when I go over the anatomical structure of the respiratory system. And I will also talk about how sounds are produced for speaking, singing, or other forms of communication, because it is part of our respiratory system if we think about it, because it is the air that we're moving out from our respiratory system through the larynx that is able to produce our sounds. Okay, whether it is just speaking in general or if we're singing. And lastly, part of the respiratory system is to be able to allow us to detect odors by olfactory receptors in the superior portion of the nasal cavity around right in that area. If you remember from last semester, we talked about the last chapter on special senses about olfactory receptors specifically, and how they're located at the very top of the nasal cavity here. And those odorants will come in through our nostril up into those receptors on the olfactory neurons, dendrites. And remember how I said that's why we have those little holes in your cribriform plate of your inside of your skull. Those dendrites is what then will relay the signal of the odorant of that particular smell to your brain, to that particular part in the brain, the olfaction cortex that allow you to smell. So that is already talked about within the special senses chapter, so we're not going to address that particular part of the respiratory system. We'll focus on the rest of these 4 functions here of the respiratory system and address them extensively about them, okay, within this particular chapter. Okay, so the respiratory system can be divided into 2 functional divisions. One that is called the conducting portion, which is basically, just the hollow tubes along the whole respiratory tract that allows air to flow through. And while air is flowing through, some of the features they will have is what enables them to filter, warm up, and humidify the inhaled air. Now, there will also be features that try to keep out as much debris and pathogens as possible to protect the lower respiratory system, which are much more delicate in structural makeup, as you will see when we get to those specific anatomical structures of your bronchial tree. Now, the respiratory portion is involves structures that actually allows for the action of gas exchange between air and blood to take place, which are then mainly the alveoli here. They are very simple in structure because their main purpose is really to allow oxygen and carbon dioxide to flow in and out, but yet they are absolutely vital in whether we are able to provide oxygen for the whole entire body. When these little structures here, even though they're simple and small, but when they are compromised in their their tissues or their structure, the amount of oxygen we can take in can actually easily go down by a big portion. Okay, and I'll talk about why that's the case when we get to that lower respiratory system structure. All right, so let's start by going over the parts of the conducting portion of the respiratory system. Well, first of all, the lining of the respiratory pathway is called the respiratory mucosa, where a mucous membrane is able to provide a series of filtration mechanisms that allows us to minimize the debris or pathogens from coming into our airway, and this is known as our respiratory defense system. And different parts of the conducting system will have different types of epithelium to serve their needs. The nasal cavity, for example, and the superior portion of the pharynx, trachea, and bronchi are all covered with the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, as we have learned a bit about from the tissues chapter last semester. Remember how we talked about how they have lots of cilia on top, okay, at the apical side of the cell right here. And that's why you see these little hairs sticking up. And there are goblet cells like these right here. Remember we identified these in lab last semester. Within the trachea, but these goblet cells are those that will secrete mucus secretions to lubricate and trap debris so they don't end up, lower down within the airway. Okay, we have a chance to trap them in the mucus and then spit them out either as our snot or as mucus stuff coming out of our mouth. And if we were to look at the surface representation of these airway, you can see it's almost as if it's carpeted with hair, like this image shown right here. It's a topical representation by a scanning electron microscope that shows you how your airways look like. See how many little hairs there are. Now, a side thing to note here is if we compare the airway of a smoker's respiratory tract versus a normal person's respiratory tract, we see a lot of hairs in the normal person, but for those that smoke, they are able to see that, on the image, they will see little dinky little hairs like that, very random and scattered all over the place, and very much lower amount of them, because what happens with cigarette smokes is that they will have chemicals that will destroy these cilia, and hence, remember, the cilia is serving for the very purpose of our respiratory defense system, and hence this is why smokers' lungs are actually prone to a lot more diseases than a normal person's lungs, because they tend to, trap whatever it is that's coming into the lungs instead of getting rid of them with the cilia, with the help of their cilia. So that's a lot of cilia that's supposed to be in there to help push debris and trash and stuff like that away from our airways. Now, the inferior portion of the pharynx actually consists of stratified squamous epithelium instead, okay? And because these are areas where a lot of abrasions from food particles will also pass and move on by. We'll talk about this again when I divide the three parts of the pharynx, which is the back of your throat, in the next few slides over. So smaller bronchioles, as we move down further into the lungs, will be made up of cuboidal epithelium with a little bit of scattered cilia. Okay, so let me circle stratified squamous epithelium for you. And when we get all the way down to the alveoli of the lungs, they are made up of simple squamous epithelium, as we have learned again from our tissues chapter. This was one of the images we were looking at in lab, or on my lecture slide last semester, to show how alveoli of the lungs are made up by simple squamous epithelial cells, which means there's not a lot of protection here. By the time we get this low into the lungs, it's needed to be thin so we can allow for efficient gas exchange between the air and the blood. Okay, we'll talk about the details of what makes up this barrier of blood-air barrier that allows for efficient gas exchange. So that is why we have to leave the job of keeping clean and, keeping the airways clean, sweeping things away from the lower part of the lungs. We have to leave that job to the conducting airways instead, that are higher up. So that's why these areas here, higher up of the conducting system, here, and here, is where we're relying on cilia, goblet cells to do what is supposed to be helping clear stuff away, so that when we're all the way down here, we don't have to worry too much about all that other debris that has already been gotten rid of through the cilia and the mucus. Okay, so don't forget the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. So there's this whole transition of different types of epithelium as we move downwards into the respiratory tract. And as I have discussed last semester in the tissues chapter, cilia is a critical structure that acts as a defense mechanism for the body. In the nasal cavity, those cilia will sweep mucus along with any debris or microorganism even that were trapped in them toward the pharynx for, maybe for expelling mucus out of our mouth, for example, or down to the stomach where we swallow them. And within the stomach, the acids and enzymes will help in getting rid of some of those harmful particles we have, inhaled or ingested. Now, in other portions, in the lower portions, for example, in the trachea, we have cilia that will beat upwards toward the pharynx, so that if things start to get trapped lower down, we can still have a chance to sweep them upwards and out of our body. So in the nasal cavity, cilia will sweep mucus downwards toward the back of your mouth, the back of your throat, pharynx, or down to the stomach. And then in the lower respiratory system, which is now we're talking about from the point of trachea onwards, the cilia will beat upwards toward the mouth so we can spit them out. Okay, so the important thing about cilia is that they have to be sure to sweep in one direction. Okay, so that's very important. because and they have to sweep in that one direction somewhat synchronously so it can successfully move things in one direction. If every cilia just sweep in any direction whenever they want, then the debris are not going to go anywhere. Okay, just imagine you using a broom to sweep some leaves, for example. If you're just waving that broom back and forth, okay, in any direction you want, the leaves are just going to fly around everywhere. The leaves aren't going to go in a nice pile that you want them to be in for them to be trashed away. So you know, if you want to sweep those leaves into a pile, you have to wave that broom in, and sweep in one direction, okay, so that the leaves can go in that direction, and then they will pile up wherever you want them to go. Okay, so similar kind of analogy there is that, this one movement, one direction movement of the cilia is what's going to sweep your mucus towards that one direction we want them to go into. Regardless upper respiratory tract or lower respiratory tract, our ultimate goal is to move them towards the pharynx and then hopefully out of our mouth or out of our nose as mucus. Whatever is trapped in there. So this movement of cilia is usually referred to as the mucociliary escalator, okay, because in a sense is really what it's doing. It's escalating, moving upwards of that or downwards, if we're talking about the nasal cavity, of debris towards the mouth. Again, it is already something we have discussed from last semester. And again, this quick video here, before that, let me erase all those stuff so you can see this clearly. Okay. All right, and again, I'll show this quick video here that illustrate how the motion of these cilia are able to move a piece of gunk from somewhere in the lower area. So when I click on that video, you will be able to see a ball and with some hairs, and you can see some gunk down here will eventually move upwards because of the action of the cilia. So here's that piece of gunk trap in the mucus, for example, and because of this one direction somewhat synchronous movement of the cilia, that little piece of gunk went from down here all the way up here. And this is an illustration of how those cilia work along our respiratory tract and why cilia is such an important characteristic or structure or feature within our respiratory tract. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the purpose and function of each of these individual parts of the conducting pathway, and we will follow them in the order in which air is moving from the outside toward the inside of the body, and hence we start at the nose, okay? As air flows into our nose, which serves as a primary passageway, that's why we start at the nose. And inside our nose is the nasal cavity right here. This is called the nasal cavity, which is usually kept moist by secretions of our paranasal sinuses that we identified in lab last semester. Remember those frontal, sphenoid, ethmoid, and maxillary sinuses we identified? We didn't really talk about them, but because it's actually part of the respiratory system in a sense, where we can have mucus coming in from those areas. And this is actually a picture right here of the frontal section of our face. And you can see that the position of the frontal sinus right here and the maxillary sinus and how big that maxillary sinus is. And if your maxillary sinus, if you have, sinus infection or you have allergies or something, I actually saw this at my dental appointment when they do that whole skull scan x-ray of your skull for your teeth. You can actually see some fluid kind of accumulating around that area within the maxillary sinus. It's pretty cool. All right. So now as far, as air flows through the nasal cavity, it actually, not a huge empty space back there after the nose, as you can, you think you will see from this empty space. But if you look at this frontal section of your face, you don't see a big hole around the nose area. You actually see this pretty cool looking curves that almost make our nose look somewhat like a musical instrument of some sort. If you really, if you look at it carefully, these narrow grooves around the nose are called the superior, middle, and inferior meatuses. Okay, so that's what those spaces and gaps and curvatures are called, and they are formed by your superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha. Okay, remember we had to identify some of those concha within the opening of our nose on the skull in the bone lab last semester, and this is what those bone areas are forming with the tissues in there to form these little meatuses that allows for airflow. There's actually a reason, functional reason why these meatuses are curved in this particular manner. Okay, so they are curved to create what's called air turbulence, so that when we breathe in air along with whatever comes in as airborne particles, they have a chance to smack and stick against the mucus lining along those meatuses. In a sense, if it's forcing those particles to have to come in contact with our mucus epithelial walls, so then we can have a chance to expel them back out along with the mucus. I mean, imagine if it's just one big hole, giant hole, in back of your from your nostrils toward the back of your nose, then all that air and dust and debris that goes along with the air goes straight into your airway very easily. But instead of a giant hole, we have these particular curvatures within our nose to make sure we're forcing those air to flow through very narrow gaps, that they will have a chance, whatever it is that comes in with the air, pollen, dust, whatever it is, they will be able to stick to the lining, so then we can, blow our noses. When we blow our nose, we'll be able to remove some of that stuff from inside. Now, the other purpose that these meatuses provide is extra time for air to move through our nose, so that it will allow for warming and humidifying the incoming air. So our nose and airways won't get irritated with cold and dry air coming through. So the way these meatuses are shaped are for two purposes, so that airborne particles have a chance to stick, and in a sense we can expel them, and for warming and humidifying that incoming air. Now, after our nose, the air will then flow into the next section of our respiratory pathway, which is the pharynx. The fancy word for back of our throat. This is a large region right back here, that we refer to as our throat. And the whole region can be divided into three parts. The nasal pharynx which is a superior portion of right here in the back of the nasal cavity. So let me use another color. I'm going to use blue. So this region right here is referred to as the nasal pharynx, because it's right in back of the nasal cavity. Again, it's lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and the epithelium kind of changes as we go down the pharynx. But it's filled with cilia to sweep those mucus again downwards, so that we can either spit it out or swallow them down into the stomach. Now, remember, we mentioned from last chapter that this is also where your pharyngeal tonsil is, right here, this little gland-looking thing at the back of your throat, okay? So that's where your pharyngeal tonsil is at for the lymphatic system. The next section of the pharynx is called the oropharynx, so it's about right here in this region. And because now we are sharing this space with food, because you see this is the oral cavity right here with your tongue, and when we eat, it'll come back here, go all the way down back here too, so it can get to the esophagus. So that's why your throat, your pharynx in a sense, is sharing this space with air and things we eat or drink. Okay, so that's why we, change this epithelium in the oral pharynx area right here have to change to stratified squamous epithelium in order to stand those abrasions coming in from you ingesting those food particles. Okay. And then the last section of the pharynx is called the laryngeal pharynx right here. Okay, laryngeal pharynx, and it is still also lined with your stratified squamous epithelium to resist the abrasions, chemicals, and pathogens that can come through. Sometimes some particles can get into our airway as well, and we get that cough reflex to move things back up our airways because no solid stuff is still supposed to go into our airway. So other than air, there can be other particles moving or trying to move into that area. So this is a way we can get rid of them. And it's easy to remember the names of these three sections of the pharynx because the prefix of these three sections has to do with where they're located. So naso for nasopharynx, okay, for being in the back of the nose, oral for being in the back of your oral cavity, and then laryngo for being in the back of your larynx. Okay, pretty simple. And as we follow our pathway of air past the pharynx, we will arrive at the larynx. Okay, larynx. And which is what people like to refer to as well as our voice box, okay? And it has a few other functions and structures other than just forming our voice. The whole structure of the larynx is actually made up of cartilaginous tubes. As you can see, lots of blue here and all over the place. All those blue areas in this particular picture of the larynx is cartilage. A type of connective tissue we talked about last semester. So these cartilaginous tubes within the larynx are usually stabilized by multiple ligaments, and thankfully we don't have to know the names of all these ligaments like we had to do for our vertebrate bone joints and knee joints. Okay, you can see how much ligaments that you technically have to know, but maybe if you're going to medical school you may end up having to know it anyway. But for now, we're just introductory class, so we don't have to know all those little details. You just have to know the names of a few cartilage pieces here in the larynx. And since the larynx is what allows air to flow through, there is an opening around right here in this region, okay, because this is the interior part of the larynx. If we flip to the back, the posterior part of the larynx, and look down into the larynx area, you will see an opening right here. And that particular opening is called the glottis, okay? Which is just a slit opening that goes between our vocal cords. Okay, we'll talk more about this in a bit when we get to, how we are able to produce voice in terms of our sounds. So here there are, we have three large pieces of cartilage that forms the larynx. Okay, we'll name the other two smaller ones in the next slide when we talk about how our voices form. But when we look at the larynx, there are three major pieces. You have first the largest piece, which is right here. And it is called the thyroid cartilage. It is called the thyroid cartilage because the thyroid gland is actually located right below it. So on some models of the larynx, you'll be able to see the thyroid cartilage, and then there will be a thyroid gland. Remember, we talked about in the endocrine system that the thyroid gland is this butterfly-shaped organ right underneath. So it will kind of sit right below it like that. Okay, so that's why we call it the thyroid cartilage. The cartilage itself is made up of hyaline cartilage. Remember from the connective tissue category in the tissues chapter last semester, you had to identify three specific kinds of cartilage: hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. So we're going to also, this is where all those tissues you'll learn come into application, is this anatomy and physiology 2, where we now are defining particular parts in the body with these special different kinds of connective tissues and different kinds of special tissues. Now, at the interior portion of this cartilage is a pointy edge right here, okay? This pointy edge is called the laryngeal prominence, or what we commonly refer to as the Adam's apple, okay? Now, you may wonder why once males hit puberty, why do they have a larger Adam's apple or more protruded Adam's apple? Well, that's due to the fact that testosterone, which is the male sex hormone that they start producing once males hits puberty, testosterone induces the changes in the size of the larynx that give them a deeper voice and a larger larynx overall. Okay, and in the sense, when you have a larger larynx, you're going to have a more protruded laryngeal prominence right here. You see this pointed area. So if we actually look at this from the side, from the lateral side, it kind of like forms this pointy edge right there that forms that Adam's apple in a person's neck. Okay. So the bigger that laryngeal prominence is, the more protruded that Adam's apple will be around the neck area. So we'll talk more about voice production in a bit, like I was saying. Now, the smaller piece of cartilage that sits below the thyroid cartilage is called the cricoid cartilage right here. Okay, so this is the cricoid cartilage. And it is also made up of hyaline cartilage. It actually gets expanded at the posterior part of the larynx here to support and protect the glottis and entrance of the trachea. So it kind of wraps itself around from the front, small area right here. When you wrap to the back, it kind of comes up in this big piece back here. Okay, because the thyroid cartilage is right here and the opening of the glottis is right here, so it's good to have this expanded region of the cricoid cartilage to ensure to stabilize this opening, because what happens is why the thyroid cartilage doesn't come all the way back here is because of this existence of what's called the epiglottis, and it actually needs to come downwards and fold over this opening whenever we swallow. I'll talk about this next. Okay. But then from the cricoid cartilage on, ligaments like here, between here, will attach the cricoid cartilage, the first tracheal cartilage right here. And I'll talk about the details of tracheal cartilages in a bit. Now, a third piece of cartilage, which I have, already briefly mentioned, and it actually has a very important function compared to the other two, is called the epiglottis right here. Okay, this whole tongue piece of looking thing. Okay, it is made up of elastic cartilage compared to the other two. So remember, thyroid and cricoid cartilage is made up of hyaline cartilage. Epiglottis, because it has a very important function to do, it is made up of elastic cartilage instead. It kind of serves, so epiglottis serves to form a lid over the glottis and will automatically fold downwards towards here to, kind of acting like a little trap door to cover up your airway every time you swallow. Now, this trap door is what prevents food or liquid from flowing into your trachea. Excuse me. And they will just slide down the top of your epiglottis into the esophagus instead. Excuse me. What you saw in lab on one of the histology pictures is that the esophagus is actually located right in back of the trachea. They are these two hollow tubes that lined up right next to each other. So in order to prevent food and drink from accidentally flowing into the wrong tube, we have this very important epiglottis serving as our little trap door. When you look at cross-section images, you'll see the trachea as a nice circle like this, and you might see a little flattened, smooth muscle-looking thing back here. So that would be the esophagus sitting in back of your trachea opening. Okay. And you saw, you'll see that in one of the lab pictures of the trachea. All right, so, but, sometimes, interestingly, we can confuse our epiglottis as what it should do. For example, when we just let's say you took a large gulp of soda or tea or something, you're trying to swallow it, but at the same time, someone next to you decided to crack a really funny joke that made you want to laugh. So you end up choking and spitting the drink out, okay, or some of that drink comes out of your nose instead, because, you're confusing the epiglottis to either close down on your airway, allow you to gulp down that drink you just drank, okay, or open the epiglottis to allow you to laugh, okay. So you may even go into that embarrassing momentarily a period of time where you have that nonstop coughing because you just choked on that drink. Well, part of that laughing is moving that air out of your airway, okay? We laugh like that, right? Which means air is coming out, and which will need the epiglottis to open in order to allow that air to come out. But at the same time, you were just trying to swallow that gulp of drink, which needs your epiglottis to be closed. So it ends up being confused as, what it needs to do. So you end up choking instead because a bit of that drink may have went down the airway instead. And any solid particles, whether really solid food or drink that goes down the airway and touches the glottis will actually trigger a coughing reflex automatically, so we don't end up having those food or drink particles go down even further into our airways, okay? And that coughing reflex is really just a blast of air coming up from our trachea to eject whatever material that is in the airway, which is why we go into that embarrassing temporary moment of continuous coughing, and your face gets all red and stuff, is because it's your natural reflex to try to empty your airway out, whatever have went down the wrong tube. So this animation that I will show you in a bit is how the epiglottis works and what happens when things go down the wrong tube. It's just nice to be able to visualize it by an animation.
Inhaled air and ingested nutrients both pass through the oropharynx behind the oral cavity. A cartilaginous structure called the epiglottis directs food and fluid away from the trachea and into the esophagus, preventing inhalation of this material. The stem of the epiglottis attaches to the hyoid bone and the anterior rim of the thyroid cartilage. The superior portion of the epiglottis moves freely and can swing up or down like a trapdoor. With each swallow, the larynx rises and the epiglottis folds down over the laryngeal opening, closing off the airway. If particles make their way into the trachea, the cough reflex pushes air forcefully up through the larynx, forcing the particles back up and out.
Okay. Okay, now on to the rest of the larynx now for the production of sound function. Now, there are two additional smaller pieces of cartilage that I mentioned earlier at the posterior side of the larynx. The larger one here is called the arytenoid cartilage, and the smaller pointy one up here is called the corniculate cartilage. Okay, so arytenoid cartilage down here and smaller one corniculate cartilage here, and you need to identify these on the models as well of the larynx, and you see how they're sitting on the posterior side of the cartilage, and both of them kind of participate in the function of opening and closing of the glottis for the production of sound. Now, within the opening of the larynx, there are two pieces of tissue that prevent things from coming through into the airway called the vestibular folds, right here. Okay, these are your vestibular folds, and they are inelastic and act as a protection for the delicate vocal folds underneath them. If you look at the actual image of a person's larynx, you can see how this cartoon image is really different from what it looks like, but this is the vestibular fold, and you can see the shadow underneath that shows that the vocal cords right here is actually located underneath the vestibular fold. Okay, so vestibular folds acts as protection over the vocal folds as well. Now they are in the center of the vocal folds are commonly referred to as the vocal cords. So these are the vocal fold or either way, vocal fold, vocal cord, however you want to put it, is the same thing. And these are contrary to the vestibular fold. They are highly elastic because they need to change in length to produce different pitches of sound. Okay, so for vestibular fold is not elastic. Vocal folds are highly elastic because they're for two very different functions. So the next question is, and then, that changes in length of the vocal cords is what enables us to produce different pitches of sound that I'll talk about in a bit. So you may ask next, how is sound produced from our voice box? Well, air will move up from our trachea and flow past through the open glottis to vibrate these vocal cords right here. Okay, so when it opens, air is going to flow upwards from the trachea. Okay, and when it flow upwards, these are acting like little strings that will vibrate in response to produce sounds. Now, this process of producing sound waves via vibration of your vocal cord is called phonation. Okay, the process is called phonation, and is really a lot like a little chord instrument we have built into our throat. Okay, it's kind of how that all works, is that vibration of chords that produces a sound. And I will show a short clip of this process in a bit of a real person that actually took a video of their vocal cords while they're speaking and singing a little bit. And it's a pretty interesting video. And hence the pitch of our sound, whether we're trying to sing like sopranos or the bass, it depends on the diameter and length, okay? Diameter and length of our larynx and the tensions we can produce on our vocal cords, our vocal folds. The diameter and length of the larynx has to do with the overall size of your larynx, while the tension of the vocal folds is something we can voluntarily control with our muscles that will change the position of the arytenoid cartilage relative to the thyroid cartilage. If you look at it right here, here's your arytenoid cartilage, here's your, part of your thyroid cartilage, and there's this little piece of white thing that connects your arytenoid cartilage with the thyroid cartilage. That is your vocal ligament right there. And depending on the movement or stretch of your ligament, by moving these arytenoid cartilage, you will be able to produce different pitches of sound. When the distance between these two cartilage, talking about between arytenoid and thyroid cartilage, increases, imagine if this piece of cartilage moves outwards this way and moves out, is going to cause this vocal ligament to become more stretched and tenses up. And when the vocal cords tense, it's kind of like pulling them farther apart, pulling these two cartilages farther apart. When this cartilage moves, the pitch of your voice will rise. This is what enables you to have very, very high-pitched sounds, Excuse me for my high-pitched sound. And then when the distance decreases, when this arytenoid cartilage, for example, move this way, it allows this ligament right here to become relaxed. Okay, so when this relaxes, and the distance of this cartilage with the thyroid cartilage is smaller, the pitch of your voice will then become lower. Okay, this is what allows us to speak in a very, very low pitch sounds. So this is how we can sing very high pitch, like opera singers. I'm not gonna perform because I don't have that opera singing voice. And then then at the same time, why someone can also sing very low pitch sound, like bass tone or something. Okay. All right. Now, this also explains why children tend to have higher pitched voices. Okay, not because they can't relax their vocal folds. They can still have different pitches of sound. Children can still sing. It's because their larynx sizes are a lot smaller than adults because they're, overall a smaller individual. So the smaller the larynx, the higher the pitch sound that will be produced overall. Now, but when males go through puberty, like I said, testosterone will actually enlarge the size of your larynx. It will change the shape of it, and their vocal folds will become thicker and longer as well. Okay, both of which makes their voice become lower and deeper in that sexy male voice, right? Just joking, And this also explains why when boys go through puberty, sometimes they may lose control of the pitch of their voice and may go out of tune, out of their control, not voluntarily, because their larynx is undergoing significant changes when they're going through puberty. Again, that's why you may hear them going like that or a little bit when they're trying to speak, is because of the changes that's happening within their larynx. So the enlargement of the larynx is also why males have that larger Adam's apple or laryngeal prominence we talked about earlier after puberty. Okay. All right, so while phonation is the production of sound waves through our vocal cords, articulation is what allows for clear speech and enunciation. Okay, this will depend on our voluntary movements of our tongue, teeth, and lips to form the sounds of words. This is why when we were young, maybe your elementary teacher always tells us, to not mumble when we talk. When we mumble, we can't hear what we're saying, okay? We have to open our mouths so we can speak and enunciate those words properly, okay? We may look ridiculous moving our mouth a lot, but whenever, or for example, when I'm voice recording like this, I make sure I'm moving my mouth a lot so that you can get a clear sound coming through, and not YouTube will be able to recognize what words I'm speaking to provide you with captions. But if I start mumbling like this, you're going to get a gibberish of words because they can't understand what I'm saying. So the formation or articulation of sounds and words have to be formed by other parts that is not part of your respiratory system. Now, the nasal cavity, paranasal sinuses, and the pharynx, that empty space back there, is actually kind of act like, a subwoofer to a speaker, if you know what I'm talking about. Those little bass on the bottom that amplifies your, and vibrates your whole house. Those will create kind of like the same way. It will create amplification, vibrations, and echoes that will create your own personal distinctive voice. So all that together comes into how your voice sounds like and how loud you are, or what kind of voices you're able to make. Okay. And this is why when we're sick with a stuffy nose, for example, if we have sinus infection or common cold and we're just full of mucus around the nasal cavity area, this is why our voice changes. It's because our nasal cavity and sinuses are full of fluids and mucus instead of air. So how sound waves move through air versus sound will then be different. Okay, so that's why we would sound more muffled or a lower voice whenever we have, when we're sick with a stuffy nose, okay? All right, and as we have been consistently talking about throughout the semester, our larynx can get inflamed as well, called laryngitis, okay? So whatever is inflamed and with the itis. So larynx inflammation, laryngitis, and that makes our voice usually sound very hoarse, like this or something, like you can't speak. Thankfully, a lot of mild cases of laryngitis are temporary and just need to be, need some rest from speaking too often or loudly to get the tissues to heal and repair on its own. So that's one thankful thing compared to other itis we've talked about, like pericarditis, okay, or tonsillitis. On the other hand, if one's epiglottis gets infected, it can actually become a dangerous situation, especially if we're talking about in young children. Now, acute epiglottitis can happen when bacteria or virus infects the epiglottis through throat infections. And remember, inflammations comes with swelling, okay, as we have mentioned before, with the effects of inflammation. So the whole epiglottis can become so swollen that it can actually block and close the glottis and inhibit ability to breathe in young children. So this is a perfect picture to show you that a normal larynx looks like this little flap right here, but a swollen, inflamed epiglottis can swell up to this balloon looking thing around in the back of your throat. Okay, pretty scary. And in the x-ray here, you see this whole bulge area. You see this is supposed to be your airway going down towards your trachea. Instead of this nice open space, now you have this tiny little gap right back here due to the inflamed epiglottis. So it's very important that if this ever happens in children, that it is fixed as soon as possible and rushed to the ER. Oh, and so let me erase this. Okay, so here's what I'm going to show you next is a quick short clip of someone taking video of their larynx to show the process of phonation as we have discussed. Now, how they did that, I have no idea. Maybe they know a doctor or something that can have one of those camera that goes down your throat. Pay close attention though to his vocal folds and how it vibrates when he sings. Okay, and don't copy unless you have a medical personnel next to you to do this. But and if you want, there's actually videos on YouTube with a whole choir of larynx singing at different tones of a song. It's pretty cool. But here's one very short clip showing you the larynx as it open and close when it's talking, and a little bit of sound vibration when the person sings for a short period of time. Okay, let me get this out.
Hello. I haven't had visitors in so long.
What are you?
I'm a voice box. Some people call me a larynx. See my two vocal cords moving apart and together as I talk?
Right there.
They come apart so that the air can get through them, and they come together to vibrate and make sound as I exhale. Let me show you.
So you kind of saw how that vocal folds was vibrating when he was talking. And that's pretty cool. Okay. All right, so let's moving on to going past the larynx. We have finally arrived at the trachea, which is this whole section right here. This whole section right here. Along your respiratory tract. The trachea is basically a long, tough, yet flexible tube that goes down all the way into our lungs before it branches off into our different bronchi. So from right below the cricoid cartilage, which is this one right here, are the rings of these tracheal cartilage, and then it splits into your left and right primary bronchi. Okay, so this is your right primary bronchi. This is your left primary bronchi. Okay, remember it's opposite of what you are looking at because you're looking at the patient's lungs. Okay. And you can tell, again, you can also call them, the other name for primary bronchi is main bronchi. Okay, I just find them easier to remember by primary and secondary, but a lot of times, even when you read your lab manual, they like to refer the primary bronchi by its proper name with the main, and then the lobar bronchi, which is a secondary one right here, going this way, and this one going this way and this way. Actually, three of them here. Two of them here, and then three of them there. It's not showing the other one. But it's secondary bronchi, also called lobar bronchi. Okay, so these, and then further onwards, these little ones here are called the tertiary bronchi, or also called segmental bronchi. Don't worry about it. This image doesn't really show a good differences of the three branches of your what we call bronchial tree. The next slide, I'll talk more about them again. So the epithelium in the trachea is continuous with the larynx, and it contains your tracheal glands. Like goblet cells we talked about for mucus secretion. Now these 15 to 20 tracheal cartilage here is what will prevent our airways from collapsing or over expanding them when pressure changes within. If our airway was just made up of epithelium all by itself, a flexible little piece of tissue, whenever we breathe in or out, it will change the pressure within the hollow tube of the trachea, and this can actually cause the tissue to collapse on each other. So instead of that happening, we don't ever want that to happen. We have these harder ridges formed by these tracheal cartilages all along your trachea to keep them open. Okay, that way our trachea will always stay open regardless of what pressure of air is flowing through our airway. Kind of like those ventilation tubes where you can see rings of hard plastic along the whole tube. That's kind of like an illustration of what trachea is like. Now, the other thing you may notice in that with these tracheal cartilage is that they actually don't go around the entire circumference of the trachea. They kind of form this C-shaped structure right here with an opening back here that doesn't get any cartilage tissue in the back. Now, there's a reason for this, a good reason too. Remember I mentioned how the esophagus is another tube that lies directly behind the trachea like this here. So it's kind of lying right next to the trachea. This is the trachea, this is the esophagus. And what's different about the esophagus is that there are food and liquid particles that are moving through when we eat or drink. And sometimes we eat a big bite, sometimes we eat a small bite. So for the times when we take a large bite, our esophagus has the capacity to expand and allow the food to go through. It'll get big like this and allow food to go through. Now, inside our neck is already cramped enough. There's not a lot of space in there. So if the trachea was a full circle around the tube, if it was a full circle like this of cartilage, okay, hard cartilage, and then there's your esophagus all smushed back there, there's not a lot of space. So when the big chunk of food trying to come through the esophagus, the opening of the esophagus, there won't be much room for it to expand into, and we may end up choking on eating bigger bites of food. And so instead of having to ask someone to do a Heimlich maneuver every time we need to take a big bite of a burger, for example, the way these C-shaped tracheal cartilages are designed to be is allow for that more room for the esophagus to expand into this region if necessary for bigger, pieces of food that will go down the esophagus. Unless we really gulp down a humongous mass of food, then we're pretty safe from needing to be saved from choking all the time. Okay, but choking does happen, as you commonly know. If you were to swallow a whole ball of food or something, you accidentally swallow. Someone threw a ball, a tennis ball or something. I don't know, a ping pong ball, and you accidentally swallowed it. Then you need someone to help you with the choking process. Okay, unchoking you. And as we have mentioned already, the airway down to the lungs is divided into 3 levels of respiratory branches called the bronchial tree. Okay, so this is referred to as the whole bronchial tree right here. Down here, bronchial tree. And that's why they're, color coded like this on these 2 images. So once we get down to the split here, where we have your left and right bronchi, two main bronchi or primary bronchi, the C-shaped tracheal rings then becomes a full ring of cartilage around. So here in the trachea, we still have that C-shaped cross section, if we look at it, of the cartilage. But by the time we're down here, it becomes a full circle of cartilage. Because is no longer bound to the esophagus by the time we're down there, splitting into your left and right bronchi. And interestingly, the right main bronchi or primary bronchus is actually larger in diameter. So we're talking about this one right here is larger in diameter than the left, and also descends at a much steeper level. If we look at this coming down this way versus this coming down more upwards that way. Okay, so let me erase that to illustrate that a little better. Okay, so here's the trachea coming downwards, and then it goes in a sharp angle down this way, whereas here it goes in a less steep angle going towards the right side. The left side. Okay, so hence it is more common because of this being a larger diameter and also being steeper this way. It is a lot more common to find objects stuck in the right bronchus than the left bronchus, because things tend to fall towards the side that has a bigger space and opening, and also going straight down into that area. Okay. And anatomically speaking, the right lung has 3 lobes of tissue, hence the right main bronchus is split into 3 smaller lobar or secondary bronchi, as you can see the 3 different colors here. Okay, so you have this, again, I have to erase that to show that. Okay, so you have the one right here, and one right there. Okay, 3 segmental or lobar or secondary bronchi. Okay, 3 lobar or secondary bronchi. So primary bronchi, secondary. Okay, so 3 different colors here, 1 main bronchi and then 2 splits of the secondary bronchi. Okay, the left has only 2 lobes, so that's why the left has only 2 lobar bronchi. Okay, so 1 lobe here, 1 lobe of lung. Superior lobe versus inferior lobe. This one has superior, middle, and inferior lobe on the right side. Now, each lobar bronchus is then split into even smaller branches called the segmental or tertiary bronchi. Okay, so these right here that you're seeing, let me use another color. These right here that you're seeing, okay, is the smaller tertiary bronchi. So that's why here you see the 3 different colors in this particular image. Green here is the primary, blue is a secondary, yellow is a tertiary. Or going from main, lobar to segmental, okay, primary, secondary, tertiary. And so each segmental bronchus will supply air to 1 bronchopulmonary segment as defined by these colors here. So this is 1 bronchopulmonary segment. This blue here is another bronchopulmonary segment, and the right lung would have 3 segments because it has 3 lobes. With the yellow here, this is another bronchopulmonary segment, and this is the last bronchopulmonary segment of the right lung. And each pulmonary segment is, bronchopulmonary segment, technically speaking, is towards that one region of the lung or lobe of the lung. Now, when we go down from the main bronchi, to the segmental bronchi, there will be progressively less and less amount of cartilage as well. And by the time you get to lobar bronchi, we no longer have cartilage rings. I'll show you that in the next slide over. But you will have cartilage plates instead of cartilage rings. And the amount of smooth muscles, however, will increase. So cartilage decreases, but the amount of smooth muscle increases as we go down. So we can better control airflow by changing bronchial diameter, called bronchial dilation and bronchoconstriction, kind of like what we talked about with blood vessels for maintaining homeostasis. I'm going to get to that in a bit. So remember, less cartilage as we go downwards in the respiratory tract and more smooth muscles, okay? Although it's meant to give us means of balance of regulation, homeostasis for these smooth muscles, but when these smooth muscles become inflamed and constricted from respiratory tract infections, like bronchitis, for example, then that will increase the resistance to airflow, just like how increasing resistance can decrease blood flow for blood vessels when we're constricting our airways because they are inflamed. This will also increase resistance to airflow, and it will limit our ability to breathe properly whenever we have inflammation of the bronchi or the trachea. All right, and here's a good image of how cartilage rings gradually transitions from cartilage rings here onto these little cartilage plates you're seeing all over, starting from the secondary bronchi and then the tertiary bronchi. As we go further down. And each segmental bronchus will branch into many bronchioles. Okay, so these are your bronchioles down here. And each bronchiole will end with a terminal bronchiole. Okay, so primary, okay, main bronchus, and then secondary, tertiary, smaller bronchi, bronchioles, and then terminal bronchiole. Okay. So these terminal bronchi, there's actually about, approximately 6,500 of these terminal bronchioles within each segmental bronchus. Okay, so remember we talked about how there's 2 segmental bronchus on one side and 3 segmental bronchus. Each of those segmental bronchus will branch out into 6,500 terminal bronchioles. So that's how much stuff we have, going on in the lungs. And by the time we're all the way down this low into the bronchial trees, the bronchial wall, as you can see here, no longer have any cartilage tissue. They don't have any cartilage, and mainly they will be dominated by smooth muscles instead. Again, their change in diameter size will be able to regulate air distribution in the lungs that we will discuss later in the lecture when we get to the physiology part of the respiratory system. And just like blood vessels, the 2 division of the autonomic nervous system will control bronchial diameter by stimulation of bronchodilation, meaning bigger diameter of your airway with sympathetic activation, and stimulation of bronchoconstriction, which is smaller diameter airways with parasympathetic stimulation. So notice that this is opposite of blood vessels. Okay, remember, for blood vessels, sympathetic activation will cause vasoconstriction to increase blood pressure. For blood vessels, parasympathetic activation will lead to vasodilation to decrease blood pressure. Okay, but because now we're talking about airflow instead of blood flow, it is different in terms of what the airway does under whether sympathetic activation or parasympathetic activation. Okay, and this means since if we think about oxygen, think about oxygen supply if we're talking about whether we're doing bronchodilation and bronchoconstriction. During sympathetic activation, we are in that fight or flight mode. We need to run away from that guy that's chasing us down the alley or that angry dog that's sitting in the alley, which means we need to power our muscles with a lot of ATP, which means we need to increase cellular respiration rate, and which means we will be in need of a lot more oxygen. And in order for more oxygen to flow into the lungs, our airways need to increase in diameter. So this is why under sympathetic stimulation, you need to do bronchodilation, not bronchoconstriction. Just think about how you are breathing very hard when you're working out or going for a jog. It just doesn't make sense for our airways to close up even smaller when we are in need of more air. Okay, so just, if a question on the exam comes up, just think of it. Deep breathing, okay? Deep breathing when we're in that sympathetic mode, which means we need to open up our airways more, okay? And hence, this is why when an individual has an asthma attack, is actually a result of an excessive stimulation of the parasympathetic stimulation. Okay, I would add parasympathetic stimulation. And sometimes constriction can get to a point where it completely prevents airflow along the terminal bronchioles right here in this region. And it doesn't matter if air is still flowing somewhat nicely in the gap, because with asthma, you still constrict up here and up here as well. There's smooth muscles around that area as well. But the main point is if air doesn't get down here, you're not going to be able to breathe, okay? So what's important is getting air to the alveoli down here so oxygen will be able to diffuse over to the bloodstream. So if this completely closes up, it might as well be as we're not breathing because we won't be able to get oxygen anymore. And each terminal bronchiole will branch even more to several respiratory bronchioles, like right here. Okay, these are the respiratory bronchiole, kind of like a little bunch of grapes if you're plucking off a bunch of grapes from the grape vines. By the time we're all the way down here into the bronchial tree, these respiratory bronchioles have the thinnest and most delicate tissues compared to those other parts of the conducting pathway up in the trachea area or the main bronchi. So respiratory bronchioles have usually only a few scattered cilia and no mucus cells or glands, and because it's not supposed to be filled with fluid by the time we get down here, the only thing alveoli have is a very, very thin layer of water that allows for diffusion of gases, but it's not supposed to be filled with mucus. We want this area to be nice and open for air and gas exchange, and hence if any debris and pathogens was able to bypass all that stuff or immune processes or defense mechanism up here and get all the way down here, then it's almost likely that they will cause or end up with some sort of damage to gas exchange surfaces because of how thin and delicate they are by the time we get to down here. So that's why the defense mechanisms is very stringent when we're talking about the upper portion of our respiratory tract to limit the damage we can cause in our lower respiratory tract. Okay, all right, so let's stop here for part 1. It's been on a little bit over an hour, and we will continue with part 2 of this lecture.